Welcome to the First Responder Wellness Podcast. This is episode number 62, and I'm so glad you're here. My name is Conrad Weaver. I'm the director of the PTSD 911 documentary, and my goal is to bring you content that will help you improve your life, whether you're a first responder or not. So here's a question for you. Is your check engine light on? I'm not talking about your car. Well, if that's the truth, yeah, it's time to get that looked at as well. But what I'm talking about is your mental health check engine light. My guest today is Dr. Brooke Bartlett, and she says that too many of us are running around with the check engine lights on, and we just keep ignoring it. That's probably been true in my life in the past. And eventually, if we just let that happen and don't do anything about it, we will have problems. And in this episode, we talk a lot about sleep and about the impact of the lack of sleep, what it has on our body, on our mind. And we also talk about how our bodies, physical bodies, and our brains are connected, and what we do with our bodies impacts our brain. And so Dr. Bartlett gives us some practical advice on how to get a better night's sleep, and she gives us some tools for managing stress. So stay tuned. Just a reminder that I'm here every Wednesday with a brand new podcast episode, so be sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. And if you like what you hear, share it with someone, your friends, your family, your coworkers, and so forth. I would really appreciate it. And if you have some time, be sure to leave a review. That really helps us grow the show. Hey, thanks so much for listening. And now here's my conversation with Dr. Brooke Bartlett. Well, Dr. Bartlett, welcome to the First Responder Wellness Podcast. It's great to have you on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about you, your background, what you do, and what's your connection to first responders.
Yeah, so I am a clinical psychologist, and that basically means I do a lot of different things. So I run my own practice, my own business. It's called the Center for Trauma, Anxiety, and Stress. And I do a lot of different things in that. I have a therapy practice where I see people for therapy. But a lot of what I do is more on the wellness programming side for first responders and for agencies. And that's very diverse. I do things like help develop peer support programs, suicide prevention programs. I do speaking engagements. So it's just kind of just a lot of different things, wellness visits, et cetera. But I started working with first responders many, many years ago when I started my doctoral training. I was originally on track to become a purely military specialist, military psychologist. So the road to becoming a clinical psychologist is pretty long. It takes like 12 to 15 years of school and training and like residencies and stuff. And when I started my doctoral program, we had just formed a relationship, a connection with the Houston Fire Department. I got my PhD at University of Houston. But prior to that, I'd been working at the National Center for PTSD, working with combat veterans, like I said, on track to do that. And it kind of just fell into my arms, so to speak, that I got connected with working with first responders, and I immediately loved it. And I was like, well, there's a lot of overlap between these two populations. And so I knew from then that I was going to spend all the remaining 7 years of my training specializing in working with first responders. So I was fully embedded in the department and in surrounding departments. I was there for therapy. I was there for critical incident responses. I was there for promotions, graduations, line of duty death funerals, developing a research program. I conducted research nationally with first responders. So I really just kind of immersed myself in it. So when I finished all my training and got licensed, I opened up my business to continue to do that almost exclusively.
Yeah. Well, it kind of reminds me of so I have an undergrad degree in psychology, and I had debated on what do I want to do. And I think I looked at that pathway and I was like, oh, that's a long time. I don't have that kind of patience. And so I never pursued a graduate degree in that. But, it's kind of come full circle now because I deal with people like, I work with people like you, and I talk about PTSD and all these other things, so it's kind of come full circle for me. But I'm really interested in your research and study in how trauma affects the brain, how it affects the body. What were some of the big aha moments for you in your research?
That's a great question. Some of the big aha moments for me in my research, well, one of them being, and this sounds kind of silly coming from a psychologist that this was an aha moment, but I'll admit that I wasn't fully bought in on this at the time until then, was that the brain and body, mental health and physical health are not two separate things. They are not mutually exclusive. If you neglect one of them, typically your health will fail in that area, and then it actually directly affects the other area. And so, in the work I do now and the work I do with departments, unfortunately, I still find that a lot of departments put all their funding into, the physical side, which is great. Keep the physical funding going, but completely neglect the other side of things. And, their workforce is struggling. A lot of different things. So that was one of the aha moments, is that, wow, this is a lot more complex than, okay, our physical health and our physical body, okay, eating a good diet and exercise, all of which are important, but not also intentionally focusing on this as well, which is a physical part of your body, the most complex part of your body, leads to negative outcomes for both physical and mental health as well.
So what are those connections? How does my workout regimen or lack thereof affect my brain?
That's a great question. So there's a lot of answers to that. I'll give you a couple.
It's complicated, huh?
Yeah. So there's not one direct answer to how that affects your brain. I'll give you a couple of them. Just at the most immediate level. When we work out, our body secretes certain hormones, certain chemicals in our body, some of which are basically used to keep, let's just think about it as like keep dopamine up in our brain, right? It releases certain chemicals that help put us in a better mood, basically. So at the immediacy, right? Physiologically, it helps us with that. If we're talking about physical exercise in the body in terms of maintaining a healthy body weight, things like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, all of that is directly tied to higher rates of depression, anxiety, and every other type of mental health condition you can imagine. Our gut health, we have a nerve that literally goes directly, it's called a vagus nerve, directly from our gut into our brain. Quite literally everything you put into your body is fed into your brain. So if you're putting a lot of trash into your body, that's going into your brain and affecting your brain. On a not strictly physical level, when we're talking about exercise, for example, engaging in things that we find personally fulfilling, personally challenging, let's say mastery, I'm trying to get stronger or build, hit a PR in something, all of that also contributes to improved mental health. So both on the physical and the mental level.
So the candy bar I had today after lunch probably wasn't the best thing to feed my brain.
Well, here's the funny thing though. Here's the thing. The more and more every day I live, I learn more and more that the whole moderation is key is really true. Like with everything, right? So is eating a ton of candy bars great for you? No, of course not. We know that. But actually, maybe you eating that candy bar was a net win because maybe, it put you in a better mood. You rewarded yourself after doing something. You really felt like it. It made you feel good at that time, right? Maybe your body was actually craving the sugars at that time and maybe it needed it, right? So maybe it was a net win. So it's not all the candy is bad or all alcohol is bad or, whatever it is, it's so nuanced and complex. And if we're talking about aha moments too, holy crap, is mental health complex. It's in my opinion, more complex than medical health in some ways, only because, with medical health, we can go in and I can get tested for certain things, right? It's pretty dichotomous. Like I test positive or I test negative, right? It's just very different in mental health. There's so many different parts that play a role.
Yeah, because it's like if you come to the doctor and say, "Hey, I'm depressed," you can't do an X-ray and say, "Okay, well, this is what's causing your depression," right?
Exactly. And that's because there's never just one thing that's causing you your depression. You might be able to point to and say, my depression started when I lost my job, right? And that's a catalyst, and that certainly plays, that's the catalyst to the starting, but that is not the only reason why your depression is still there and why it's gotten so bad.
So in the life of a first responder, and we know all the cumulative effect of all the things that they have experienced, I mean, when do some of these things start showing up?
That's a great question, and I don't have a specific answer for you because just like we've already been talking about, it's complex. Every human is unique. Every human has a different genetic makeup. So we're already starting from even identical twins are not actually 100% exactly the same, right? And then outside of genetics, we have a different environmental upbringing. We have different caregivers. We have different religions, morals, beliefs. We have different life experiences, all of that. All of that goes into determining why, let's say, one law enforcement officer who's been on the job for 15 years is, overall pretty healthy, hasn't had any significant issues, let's say, with post-traumatic stress disorder. And there's another law enforcement officer who's been on the job for 3 years who has severe PTSD. There's a lot of different factors that go into that. So in terms of how long it takes them to start experiencing it, it just really depends on all the complexities.
So here recently we had a shooting, I think a little over 2 years ago, and there was a rookie cop with a veteran, and the veteran, she was, I'm guessing 10 or 15 years in. I think she was a corporal, and they both got shot by this perpetrator. They both experienced trauma and are suffering from that. But here's the rookie, his first year on the job, now having this critical incident, and now he's struggling already.
Yeah.
And the other cop, I don't know if she struggled with stuff before, she may have, but here you see that immediacy of this critical incident that created this trauma and stress for this individual.
Yep. Yeah. So that's a great example. So there's a couple things I'll highlight. One is there's actual research. I worked on this research prior to starting my doctoral program. Big research study called the VETSA, Vietnam Era Twin Study of Aging. Okay, looking at combat veterans who were identical twins. Okay, who served in combat in Vietnam. So they were both exposed to the same traumas, same things, but they would recruit one who met criteria for PTSD and one who didn't. And remember, these guys are supposed to have pretty similar genetic makeups, right? Sure. So why would one have it and not the other? And this whole study, and again, they were taking blood samples, they were taking everything, mental health, all that. But the gist of it is that there were so many other factors that went into determining why one developed PTSD and one didn't. And that being also kind of what I was talking about. I call it predisposing and post-disposing factors, but basically all the things, the predisposing factors. So here we are, November 21st. My background, my upbringing, trauma that I've experienced, my religion, my morals, my values. Do I have kids? What are my life circumstances? What's my financial situation? Those are predisposing factors. And then post-disposing factors are what do I do or what do I have after experiencing some kind of critical incident, right? Do I feel like I have a good support system to go home to with my family? Am I single? Am I in a pretty bad marriage? Do I have an agency or a team, a peer support team that I feel like I can talk to? Do I go to therapy? Do I drink? Do I shut down? Do I act like everything's okay? All of these factors go into determining how trauma affects an individual, because trauma does not affect any individual in the exact same way. We are all affected by trauma in a different way. So if you and I experience the same exact trauma at the same exact time, we would be affected differently by it.
So I have an interesting question. So I dream a lot, and my dreams are very vivid for some strange reason. Yeah. And my wife is like, "You dreamed again, didn't you?" And so last night I had this dream, and it was like this weird thing. And I dream a lot about playing music because I used to do that in the past. And I was getting ready to play at my church, and I had to get something. So I went someplace and I had to crawl up into this barn. Strange, I know. And I was attacked by like 100 pigeons came flying at me, and all their crap, their shit, and all the stuff came all over me. Now I was covered in all this stuff, and I looked at my watch, it's like 5 minutes before we start, and I had to go get cleaned up, and I couldn't figure out how to go get cleaned up, and it was just real frustrating. And finally I woke up and I was like, what was that? And it's like, it's been bugging me all day. It's like, why do we dream things like that? Is it, and is it tied to something that may have happened, years ago?
Could be, could not be. Sleep neuroscientists right now at this point, to the best of my knowledge, up to date on the research, is that they don't have all the answers as to why certain people dream very vividly. I'm actually a vivid dreamer as well. I have been my whole life. I remember almost all my dreams. I wake up and I just start blabbering, and my husband's like, and he can't remember what he dreamt for 2 weeks, right? But there are certain circumstances that could influence or increase the likelihood that someone is dreaming certain types of dreams, or having certain elements of their dreams, or having nightmares. So like you said, could this be something that happened to me a while ago? It could be, right? When we think about sleep, one of the major things that is happening when we sleep, by the way, when we're sleeping, there's a lot more going on than when we're actually awake. Everything's actually, our body and brain are actually working to prepare us for when we are awake. So one of those things is emotional processing. And that happens in stage 4 of our sleep. REM sleep, and that's when we dream. So if I have, let's say it's not even trauma. Let's say there's like something really stressing me out. I'll like repeatedly dream of this thing over and over, right? Like I do this pretty frequently. Like say I have a deadline coming up, like I will dream of myself like giving that talk over and over and over again, right? Or if I'm really stressed, something else is going on in my life, I might recreate different dreams where I elicit the same feeling, right? Like if there's grief, something happened, then I might have elements in my dream that lead to grief. That's because there's all that emotional processing going on. But sometimes we dream and we're like, what the hell was that about? And there's not like a very specific answer to why there were pigeons pooping on you,
Right. Yeah, it's just, I know in the past I used to have these recurring nightmares of a situation that happened that I was involved in, and then I did this reprocessing thing with it wasn't EMDR, but it was something else with Dan Jarvis and the things that he does. It's called Trauma Resiliency Protocol. It's like a 20-minute thing that he took me through, and I haven't had a nightmare since about that, which is amazing.
That's great. Yeah, the way I explain it to people. So when we're talking about processing trauma. So I will say I do a lot of stuff on sleep and sleep trainings and stuff, just emphasizing how incredibly important for our physical and mental health sleep is. Most of our emotional processing goes on actually while we're asleep, which is why sleep is so important. But the way I describe it is while we're awake, if we're not emotionally processing, and that can mean a lot of different things. So basically, when I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to think about it. I'm going to do things to make sure I don't think about it. I'm just going to keep driving the car with the check engine light on. I'm going to act like everything's fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. That's the opposite of emotional processing. Okay. So I think about it as like, let's say we have like a filter, let's say like a Brita, right? With holes and a filter. When we're not emotionally processing during our waking hours, it's like a big rock is building up. And it's not able to filter through. So it's just stuck there, right? And that leads to a lot of other things in our waking hours that become problematic and can lead to more nightmares in our sleeping hours, or just really terrible sleep in general. But when we sleep, the filter is what is actually going on. So during our waking hours, or if we're doing therapy or any type of, exposure therapy or anything like that, it's like breaking that rock up so that now when you sleep, these things can be actually filtered appropriately and processed through. So it's not blocked up.
So first responders, as we know, don't get a lot of sleep.
Yeah.
Is that perhaps an indicator that they're going to have more problems? They're going to have more issues because these things haven't been processed.
It's a major risk factor. It's not a guarantee, right? Correlation is not causation, but it's a risk factor for sure. Whenever I have a department reach out to me and they're kind of just starting along the road to mental health and, where do we start? What do we start with? I'm always like, let's start with sleep. Let's start with sleep because it's something we all do, something we all require. It's also just a slightly easier topic to get into, when I'm coming in there and I'm not just like coming in whole hog on PTSD and things like that. But it's also just so important to develop, an protocol and provide psychoeducation about sleep and sleep tips so that they can start to improve their sleep in the best way possible. Because it might be for many first responders that like being a first responder, it's not conducive to good sleep. It's just the bottom line, right? But we can give them tips and tools so that they can at least have that to improve their sleep while they're off the job. So they're not sleep deprived while they're on shift and sleep deprived while they're off shift as well. Because a lot of first responders, because their hyperarousal is up, their circadian rhythm gets all messed up because they're running calls all night. They're so exhausted. They go home, they got 3 days off, 4 days off, and they find that they're still unable to sleep. They're awake, they can't fall asleep, or they're waking up multiple times. Their sympathetic nervous system is just really jacked up. Their body's not conditioned to sleep properly. And so that's where I come in and I help them, I help the department find ways and help, their personnel find ways to do that.
Interesting that we're talking about sleep because today I was listening to this podcast and I don't remember the name of it, but they were talking about sleep and he was talking about circadian rhythms and doing things in the afternoon, early evening, into late evening that begin to help putting that circadian rhythm back into place. Can you talk about that?
Yep, it's all about. So let me say this: our circadian rhythm. Our circadian rhythm is not associated with the production of sleep, like how many hours. So it doesn't produce our sleep. It just controls when we are awake and when we are asleep, the timing. Okay. And our circadian rhythm can in some ways be trained a little bit through a lot of consistent repetitive effort. So what you're referring to is very, very important, which is basically trying to get into a routine, especially when we're off shift. If we're talking about first responders, of doing things that starts to turn down the knob on the sympathetic nervous system. It takes proactive effort to do it. It is not just going to happen on its own. And I talk to so many first responders who'll tell me, like, first few years on the job, I could run calls all night, go home off my shift and fall asleep like that. But like now I'm finding that I can't, or even on shift, like after I get back from a call, I'm up the rest of the night and I can't go back to sleep, right? So that's that aspect of doing things so to get that sympathetic nervous system, which is like our go, go, go system. It's what raises our heart rate, what makes us more vascular so that more blood can go through. We need to do things to get that down. Now, what that is very dependent on the person. What works for me might not work for you, but I suggest having a basket of tools in your wind down routine. For example, some of mine, depending on where my brain and body are at, what my capacity is. Sometimes I puzzle if I'm not ready to just like completely shut down, right? That helps me get my mind kind of in place. Reading, hot Epsom salt baths is one of mine. Gentle stretching. Sometimes I foam roll, right? All these things are in my basket to like start turning the knob down on that.
It was something interesting that this guy was talking about. It was even the lighting in your room. He said, our bodies, before that we had electricity and all these, modern things, the light came from the sun. And so as the sun went down, it kind of adjusted us, prepared us for that night's sleep. And he said, the important thing is to maybe put your, he said overhead lights are the worst because that's directly overhead. He said, you want to lower your lights. You want to have them, at a lower level, even lower than your eyes.
Yep.
That kind of helps begin preparing your body for sleep.
Yep. So our circadian rhythm is highly reliant on external cues from our environment. Remember, our circadian rhythm, all it does is it basically controls the timing of our sleep by sending differing strengths of wake signals. So when that strength is high, right? When the knob on that strength is, when the knob is high on that, it's saying wake up. And that's why we wake up, right? If it's low, we're more likely to be more tired and be in more of a position to fall asleep. And so it's highly reliant on those external cues to determine what strength of signal it should be sending. So if I'm wanting to go to bed at 9 p.m., but I live in Alaska and it's still light as hell outside, right? And I don't have any blackout curtains, my circadian rhythm is going to be going like, all right, we're awake, right? Well, we're gonna keep that knob up, right? So doing things, another big part along with doing things to get our sympathetic nervous system down is proactively creating an environment to let our circadian rhythm know, to give it some help, to say, okay, it's time to start going to bed. It's time to start winding down. I'm going to make sure all my curtains are drawn. There's not a bunch of light coming in. The temperature, if possible, is cooler. I'm doing things that aren't getting my temperature up, right? I'm trying to keep noise level low if possible. All of those things are things that our circadian rhythm really relies on. It can function in the absence of it. So if I lived in Alaska, I'm not just going to be up for 3 months straight if I don't block out light, but it's really going to struggle without that. Because like you said, evolutionarily speaking, the way we used to operate is the sun came up and we woke up and we went out and, hunted and gathered or farmed or whatever it is we needed to do. Sun went down and we went down, and so on and so forth. So because our modern life has changed a lot, our circadian rhythm's like, hey, buddy, throw me a bone here, help me out. Just give me some direction on what's going on.
I know one of the best things that we did, this was maybe, 8-10 years ago, we took the TV out of the bedroom.
Yeah.
And, I was reading about how your body, if the TV's in the bedroom, it's the TV watching room. Well, it's not. It's the sleeping room. So remove the things from the bedroom that you continue to keep you awake. And that includes these little gadgets that is so hard to put down because most of us now use this as our alarm clock too, right? So how bad is it to have to be scrolling, when I'm laying in bed?
It's bad. It's very bad. A lot of people think it's because of the blue light or things like that. Not that that's great for you, but it's not really much about the light, or it's insignificant, much less significant. It's because all the things you're doing on your phone, those are designed to keep your brain activated. Even if your body is not feeling activated, even if you feel relaxed, you're not like, your sympathetic nervous system isn't up. Those things are designed to keep your brain going, whether you're looking at Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or reading an article or texting or whatever it is that you're doing on your phone. All of it is literally, they hire very smart people who come in and help them develop things to keep your brain activated. So that's why it's also really, really bad. There's also a whole other part. I got an on-demand course all about this, about sleep. But the other part about that is, like you were saying, we want our brain and body only to associate our bed with sleep. We don't want to be doing anything else, whether it be looking at our phone or reading or things like that, especially if you struggle with sleep problems. A lot of times, or 100% of the time, it's very behavioral. Our body starts to associate the bed with things other than sleep. And so it's not going to be consistently sleeping well.
What's one thing that someone can do? Perhaps they're having trouble falling asleep. What's one thing that they can do to begin that process of getting to a better place to fall asleep?
All those things that we were talking about, right? If we're talking about having trouble falling asleep, it'd be really proactively going in on starting to set boundaries. I literally have what I call a wind down time. I have a alarm go off, and that's when my wind down time starts. Now, sometimes if I'm traveling or I'm on call for critical incidents, think that changes. But basically when that goes off, I have to set boundaries with myself. And one example of that is I'm no longer allowed to look at my email, right? I can access my email all the time, my phone, everything, right? We have full access to it. But those are things that can stress me out, even if it's not something bad, right? But it's just, okay, so-and-so emailed me. Oh, I actually forgot about that XYZ, right? Whatever it is, we want to remove things that could cause us any source of stress or stimulation. Okay. And then we want to start replace that with all those things like I was talking about, depending on what, some people do guided meditation, some people read relaxing books, some people take baths, some people put on aromas in their house, whatever it is that works for you. We want to replace all those other things in our day to day with that once that wind down time starts. And that can really help.
Do you think a lack of sleep and continuous input, whether it's digital, whether through our phone or through other sources, do you think that can lead to shortened lifespan?
Yes. I mean, that's what the research shows.
And so it's interesting. And I don't know if my wife will hear this, but her mother passed away, 8 years ago or so. and she was a diabetic and was had kidney failure. But we'd go visit down in South Carolina, and she would sleep out in the living room on her easy chair with the TV going full blast all night long. It was like, and I'm thinking, how much did that contribute to her early death? Maybe.
I mean, so medical research has shown that chronic sleep deprivation, chronic poor sleep is a major risk factor for the development of just about everything, where they're talking about diabetes. A major study actually just came out that showed that chronic sleep deprivation leads to the development of Alzheimer's disease. One of the things our body does while we're sleeping is it basically removes waste from our brain cells, and Alzheimer's is just, plainly put, a buildup of waste in our brain cells, right? That's a part of it. So that's one part of it, what it does. So the study came out being like, oh crap, like this is actually like directly leading to the development of Alzheimer's disease. It doubles the risk of cancer. After just 1 week of not sleeping, our blood levels can be classified as pre-diabetic.
Wow.
So, I mean, people can go a really long time. And I always share, with when I'm working with departments that, I've struggled with sleep my whole life. I do everything I preach. I've done CBTI. I now provide CBTI.
What is CBTI?
Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. Okay. It's a very behavioral based protocol to recondition someone to get back into quality sleep. But yeah, we can go a long time with feeling like we're not affected. I went a very long time. I mean, most of my life until it started to I started to notice some effects. I share this all the time, but basically I always kind of like wore it as a badge of pride. Like, I'm one of those people who doesn't need a lot of sleep. I can function great, and I don't even drink caffeine. And I'm like, I'm great. I can do this all the time. I was a D1 athlete. Look at me. I'm going to get my PhD. I don't need sleep. I'm really good at this. And then it started to add up. And I started to get to the point where my memory was really starting to significantly affect my life, my poor memory. And I was like, what is going on with me? And I went and got this very expensive, thorough neuropsychological assessment that tests for a lot of different things like response times, things like that. So I'm like, there's something wrong. Maybe I have early onset Alzheimer's. And it basically came out that you're sleep deprived. And I was like, what? No. You don't understand. I've been doing this for over 2 decades now. I'm fine. And they're like, no, this is what has started to happen to your brain. And I was like, oh no. And, so then I spent many years actually starting to prioritize my sleep, went to got CBTI. And like I said, became a psychologist and, specializes in providing it. But we can do a lot without sleep for a long time.
So how can a first responder who is maybe on swing shifts, how can they manage their sleep cycles?
Yeah, so I always tell first responders the unfortunate news for them is they have to work a lot harder than us, a civilian. That's just the bottom line. They have to work a lot harder. And if they put in the same amount of effort that I do, it probably wouldn't be enough, so to speak. One thing is doing things to get their sympathetic nervous system down when they're off shift is super important. Their baseline arousal levels are much higher than civilians, right? So they have to work even harder to do that, and just prioritizing and taking advantage of regularity when they get the opportunity can really, really help, because you cannot make up for lost sleep debt, but there is neuroscience that shows you can sleep bank. And what that basically means is if I have a 4896, for example, and I'm off for 4 days, if I'm doing what I can, taking the opportunity for that regularity and getting decent sleep while I'm off shift, then what happens when I'm on shift is my sleep bank is more filled. And so it kind of offsets some of the negative impact of me not sleeping while I'm on shift due to all those runs. But I can't go into the bank when I'm already in debt and expect to be able to pull money out, right? And so that's kind of the idea, is like really prioritizing that when we're off shift, taking advantage of the regularity, doing all the things like I talked about with helping our circadian rhythm out, having to make big decisions, right? Again, all in moderation. But my point is if you spend 3 out of your 4 nights going out to the bar and getting drinks and doing all that, yeah, your sleep's not going to be great. And then you're right back into shift. So sometimes that involves making certain decisions based on the context of what's going on. For example, if I know I travel a lot, and if I'm like, okay, I got like 2 straight weeks of travel in different time zones, I know my sleep's going to be off. And my friend invites me on a Saturday night to go out for drinks at 8 p.m. and I'm leaving on Monday morning, I might say no, because I'm like, I know that's going to jack my sleep up. And then next thing I know, my travel starts, right? So it's just about making informed decisions with the information that you have.
Here's a question. How long does it take to bank that sleep if I'm just totally screwed up in a bad place?
I'm not aware of a specific timeline, but basically, if you have been sleeping terribly for 4 weeks straight and then you get 1 decent night's sleep, that would be sleep debt, right? And that's not, it's like, oh, I made up for it. But if we have consistently, like if I'm saying, I have 3 days off when I'm off shift and I'm prioritizing my sleep, like we're able to actually accumulate some quote sleep banking in that sense to offset it. But basically think about like the ratio. If the ratio is more that I spend a lot more time sleeping like crap, and then I have, a day or 2 here spurted in between that maybe I sleep okay, then you're probably more in the sleep debt than the sleep banking. So it's more, I think, of proportionality as opposed to, okay, it takes this number of days, 7 days, because you can't make up for lost sleep. So it's more, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm curious too now, I think it might make it, and maybe it's been done, research on, we know that the life expectancy of first responders is 10, 20 years shorter than the average, non-first responder. I wonder if that has a lot to do with sleep.
Yes. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. There is some funding going out right now. There's some great researchers doing some research looking like very in depth, not only on the like self-report data basically, but like they're getting, data markers, physiological data, all of that, studying more about sleep among first responders. I don't know what the timeline is on when that, research takes a long time in terms of running the research, clean up the data, publishing, doing all that. It can be, 10 years or something like that. But I do know that there is funding going out to certain researchers or institutions that are looking at that. So, and I think that's going to continue to happen. Thank goodness. There's at least there's been more of a shift in recent years of actually starting to focus on some of this stuff. But yeah, it's been scant up to now.
So in your travels across the country and interacting with first responder organizations and individuals, leaders, what have you seen that is really working with departments? What's working with individuals in mitigating some of these challenges with PTS?
Yeah. If we're talking about command staff and leadership, open-mindedness and willingness to, I guess I'm going to call it display vulnerability. And by that, I don't mean they have to cry a bunch in front of their department or, talk about deep, dark secrets or anything like that. But when it's the mindset of this is how it's always been, this is how it was for me, so stop complaining. Those are the most harmful environments. And unfortunately, I've been in them. I've seen them. And then you have the workforce, the first responders, that build up resentment. They're also, let's say they're not sleeping. They feel like command staff and leadership don't actually care. Command staff and leadership think that they're just complaining and they're like, they don't understand. I have so much red tape around me. It's not as easy as they think it is. And, I can understand from their perspective in ways too. But basically, a lot of this comes from just a shutting down of conversation. And so open-mindedness doesn't necessarily mean that you're able to grant every wish that someone has, but acknowledging the elephant in the room, listening to other perspectives, right? It's kind of like that idea of psychological safety. PTSD. And what that basically means is like you're in a work environment, whether it be your first responder or you're at a, some other kind of like law firm, but you have an environment where, you are not worried about being reprimanded in some way, right? Whether it be like, I'm not going to get that promotion, or this could affect that, or even like social reprimanding, right? That's a big deterrent for a lot of first responders, is the fear of social ostracization. We know how important cohesion is in the first responder culture. I mean, not only is it important just in the day-to-day of it feels good, but their lives depend on one another. So that fear of being socially excluded in some way is massive. So having more of that an environment with that psychological safety, those are the departments and the agencies that I see that have the most productive workforce, the healthiest workforce, not in just mental health, but also you can see it in their numbers, right? How much turnover they're having, how much money they're having to spend on recruiting and retaining, how much FMLA there is, right? All of those different things that go into that, they really are reflected.
It goes back to what we talked about earlier with how it's all connected.
Mm-hmm.
Our mental health is connected to our health, which affects everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what's important to understand too, when we're talking about post-traumatic stress, once it gets to the point of post-traumatic stress disorder, which basically means at that point that someone has a clinically significant set of symptoms that cannot be ignored now. Now it is it's consistent distress, and it's starting to impair several areas of their life, whether it be, their relationship is failing, or the relationships are failing. They're maybe starting to drink more, maybe they're physical, right? That's what I mean by impairment. That takes time to get there. You can't just diagnose PTSD overnight. In fact, there is in the medical criteria, someone experienced a critical incident yesterday, you can't diagnose PTSD the next day, because these are a normal set of reactions that people have to an abnormal event. But what leads to actual post-traumatic stress disorder it's a road of avoidance. And for first responders, a lot of that is just, I'm not going to talk to anyone about it. I'm good. I'm fine. I'm going to act like I'm fine. Maybe I feel like I am okay, and I just keep driving my car even though my check engine light is on. I don't stop to check on anything or do any maintenance. Maybe I start to do other things. Maybe I look at a lot of porn. Maybe I start to gamble more. Maybe I start to drink more, whatever it is, right? That is what leads to the development of post-traumatic stress disorder. This is not an overnight thing.
Mm-hmm. I think in the general culture, it's been kind of a thing where, I had this happen. Oh, and I have PTSD from that. People don't understand what that D really stands for, what it means.
Yes, it's definitely an overused term. The way I like to, I know there's also a big debate about like removing the D, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's not call it post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah. Maybe an injury or something.
Right. And here's just my information on this, is that when we're talking about post-traumatic stress injury versus post-traumatic stress disorder, we are talking about the same thing, the same set of symptoms. Looks exactly the same on the outset, okay? Where they differ is more in their conceptualization. And what I mean by that is when we say post-traumatic stress disorder, like I said, we are talking about what we in the biz psychology call a clinically significant set of symptoms. That means that these are not one-off symptoms, that it's not just been like a week, that now it is these symptoms are consistently sticking around and causing trouble in someone's life, right? It's been months or even for some people years, right? That this is a chronic thing and it's starting to negatively impact them, right? Once someone passes that threshold and meets full criteria for post-traumatic stress, that's when we put the D on it. And as a psychologist, it's very important to have a barometer as to where someone falls on that, not to categorize them as now you're disordered, but as a psychologist, it helps me not only to inform them of what's going on, and here's what we're seeing, but it's very important to understand in terms of going in and intervening and providing the appropriate care. If we just lump everyone into post-traumatic stress, stress, that is a big spectrum. It's a very big spectrum. You can have post-traumatic stress and still be okay. Post-traumatic stress on its own is not a bad thing. It's a normal response to abnormal events, right? When we're talking about post-traumatic stress injury, we're talking about the actual physical effects that it has on our brain and our body, okay? So this is the difference between PTSI and PTSD. Looks the same, plays out the same on the outset. It's more in their conceptualization. And so, I still use the term PTSD as a psychologist. I feel like I ethically have to, if someone is meeting full criteria, yes, it's still an injury. It's post-traumatic stress injury because now their physical brain and body has been affected. But if I'm just going around referring to someone who has severe symptoms of post-traumatic stress as the same as a cop who's been on the job for 15 years who has, I'll call it, non-clinically significant symptoms of post-traumatic stress, they need to be addressed differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's where some of that stigma comes in too, is, you have that D or you have that disorder. It's like, oh man, something's really wrong with me. Mm-hmm. I think that can cause even more stress on a person.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's where, so a lot of the work I do with agencies is providing like trainings and information. Like I come in and I do, I talk to them, I present to them because knowledge is power. And a big thing that gets in the way, not just for first responders, honestly, for a lot of people, but definitely for first responders, given that the culture is like, oh, mental health, we're not gonna, is that they don't know, they don't understand. And when you don't know, you're not going to be able to identify when it's time for you to kind of maybe do a little bit of maintenance work, right? And then what happens is it just snowballs. I keep saying the car with the check engine light, but my example when we're talking about post-traumatic stress and how it leads to severe post-traumatic stress injury, or in other words, post-traumatic stress disorder, is that when the check engine light in our car pops on, it doesn't mean that there's something terribly wrong with our car, right? It just means, hey, we need to do a little bit of maintenance. That maintenance can be something as insignificant as talking to our partner, maybe taking a week and slowing things down a little bit. Maybe we have a therapist that we reach out to, intermittently when we need to, right? That's just doing that maintenance. But when we don't do that maintenance and we just keep driving the car, I don't know if you've ever driven your car with your check engine light on, but you can do it for a long time.
You can go for a while.
I've done it when I was starting my PhD, and I ended up, my transmission blew out after about 6 months of doing that, right? That's what happens to us. Eventually that transmission is going to blow out, right? That the car, what started as something that could have been pretty easily addressed and fixed, turns into not only a much bigger problem, but it starts affecting other parts of the car, right? So when my transmission blew out, my catalytic converters got all jacked up, and then I had to go in and fix that and all these other things, right? So it doesn't even just stay in its own little bubble and get worse. It starts to permeate. It's a big, really important message for people to understand, to break that stigma. What breaks stigma, one of the things is providing information and knowledge and understanding of these things. The more we understand it, the less scary and taboo it is.
And I think it's the same thing for an agency, an organization. If they let these little things, they let individuals, and not helping, not treating them, it's going to start affecting the whole organization.
100%. Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And I have seen that a lot, or I've gotten brought in, unfortunately, I get brought in a lot after something really terrible has happened. Another person at the agency has died by suicide, and fortunately there's a lot of departments that then, that's their catalyst, that then they really start to actually put long-standing prioritization on this. But there are still some that they bring someone like me in, and then it's just kind of like, all right, we check the box and now we go back to the status quo.
You put the transmission back in the car and okay, you're off again, right?
Yep. Keep going, right? Yeah. So exactly. So that you're right. That is, it can start in one area, but then when it just goes unaddressed, it just starts to permeate to different areas.
So as we wrap up here, what's one tool I can put in my tool belt to help mitigate some of these issues?
We're talking about post-traumatic stress.
Yep.
Okay. One tool in your toolbox. So I'm going to give you two. I'm just going to touch on two. So when we're talking about post-traumatic stress, I talked about what leads to it developing into something more serious, right? It's always when we're driving our car with the check engine light on for an extended period of time. We're doing things that, we're avoiding in some way, whether it be through alcohol or through not speaking or through acting like it's okay or through getting our thrills somewhere else, right? What's really important is that we actually tune in sometimes to do our own little mini check-ins. This is something that's very small, doesn't take that much time. Here's what I like to tell people, Conrad, is sometimes what led to our major problem, let's say someone has PTSD, can be very complicated. And then people think what I have to do to fix it must be like the silver bullet or very complicated. It's a lot of little things that we do consistently and regularly that can help prevent something like this. So doing mini check-ins, checking in as to where we are, what's going on physically, how do we feel physiologically, what kind of emotions are we feeling, what's going on in our head. That can allow us to see if our check engine light is on. If it is, then we need to do other things to mitigate that. Talking, science has proven, neuroscience has proven, literally, by scanning the brain, that talking is a major protective factor against the development of severe post-traumatic stress injury because it's a form of non-avoidance, whether it be we're talking to our peer support members, anyone on our crew, we go home and we talk to someone about it. Something as simple as that is a major protective factor against the development of post-traumatic stress. And then the other sign of that, we didn't really get into it as much today, but what starts to happen with post-traumatic stress is it gets our sympathetic nervous system up all the time. We have a part in our brain that its only job is to respond to threat. And when that goes off, our fight or flight goes off, and we're up, we're on edge, which is why a lot of people with post-traumatic stress are like just a lot more jittery. They need to know where the doors are, the exits are. They don't want people walking behind them, right? So again, putting extra effort into doing things to try and get us a little bit lower, whether it be we're doing that on the job or off the job. But like I said, first responders have to work so much harder at this than your average civilian. So finding things that calm that stress system down for you and trying to limit, not completely exclude, but limit and be cognizant of things that might get your stress levels up. And the example I use for this, I'm not saying never watch the news, never look at Twitter, but maybe if you just got off of a really rough shift, right? It's just a go, go, go. You can feel it. You're just, your sympathetic system's up. Maybe that's a good time to check in and then say, I'm not going to maybe pick up my Twitter right now and look at all the shit that's going on. Maybe I'm going to wait until tomorrow morning and just kind of incorporate this other stuff. So that's what I mean by like taking context. It's not a matter of never look at it or you need to do the same thing every time. But when we check in as to what's going on in our physical body, our mental body, then we're able to make informed decisions around that.
That's great advice. That's something that I need to work on myself.
Same. It's a work in progress.
Yeah, for sure. So, well, we covered a lot today, and this has been fascinating, and just your insights are amazing. And so thank you for that. Thank you for all of the work that you do. How can people get in touch with you? How can they learn more about what you do?
Yeah, so you can find my website. It's centertas.com. centertas.com. I also have an Instagram. It's Dr. Brooke PhD. Post different things on there, little tidbits, etc. So yeah, you can find me there as well.
Awesome. Well, we will make sure we post all those links in the show notes, and so people can access that. And thank you so much for your time today and for your insights. It's been great having you on the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Conrad. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Dr. Bartlett, for being on the show today. I really appreciate it. Hey, be sure to check out the links for her website. I've put them in the show notes below. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button and then to share this podcast with your tribe. I really appreciate it. Please remember that you are not alone. And if you need someone to talk to and don't know where you can turn, you can dial 988 for help. Until next time, be well, take care of yourself and those around you, and go out and do something great in the world.